Good evening. I am delighted to welcome you to the new school. My name is Karen Coney. I'm the director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics here at the new school. Little over 3 years has passed since President Obama's inauguration in January of 2009. In his inaugural remarks, the president announced his resolve to, quote, restore science to its rightful place, and he alluded to his plans to double renewable energy supplies by, quote, harnessing the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories, end quote. Renewable or not, in the 3 years since, the harnessing of this wild horse energy has proven to be quite challenging, and there are a few examples that I'd like to point out. In the spring and summer of 2010, the spewing oil fumes of the Deep Horizon oil spill captured the world's attention for 12 weeks because no company, government agency, or technical team was able to cap the leaking pipes. The Keystone Pipeline System, an immense pipeline network to transport crude oil from the oil sands in northern Alberta to the Gulf of Mexico, has caused unaccounted for damages to roadways in Canada. And I think we've all seen images by now of how water can be made to burn in the process referred to as fracking, induced hydraulic fracturing when gas is obtained through the injection into shale rock of pressurized fluid. Energy, in other words, is in the news, and it's debated in Congress and on the street and in newspapers such as the Times today. This is therefore a moment when we once again call on the new school's fabulous faculty to help us understand an extremely complex, timely issue. And it becomes quite literally a new school moment, such an occurrence. Tonight's event on energy is timed to correspond with a series of programs organized by the Vera List Center on new notions of matter, variously referred to as new materialism, speculative materialism, thing power, or simply thingness. Specifically, we're investigating to what extent energy is more than dead matter, and perhaps a thing with directiveness or agency that cannot be harnessed in quite the manner we had expected. I am extremely grateful to my colleagues here for agreeing to examine this particular angle of energy from various vantage points, from the political and the natural sciences, from media studies, environmentalism, and design, as well as art. Tonight's talk is also timed in another way. In a light-spirited homage to energy and time, we'll shine different lights in the course of 7 minutes, 7 minutes allocated to each presentation. Green, they're going to be lit here in the front. Green is for onwards, yellow is for focus, and red calls for a closing of a presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to single out a few people, Annie Shaw and Kyle Nelson at the Vera List Center, who have been instrumental in making this event happen. Thank you. Pam Tillis in the Department of Public Programs, at the New School. And my special thanks and gratitude are reserved for Jamie Cruz, who is the third speaker from the right. As an exceptional artist in residence with the Vera List Center, she embarked on a 6-month journey of research through large geographies and time, but also minute elements of infrastructure close to home here at the New School, actually in the basement of this particular building. Thingness of Energy is the title of an art installation that was the outcome of it, and it is currently on view through early April at the Sheila C. Johnson Design Center at Parsons, the New School for Design. I'd like to thank the Green Fund, which supported this project, and the immensely resourceful Office of Sustainability, where I'd like to thank in particular Gwen Kilvert, Assistant Director of Sustainability and Energy Management, and Joshua Cohen. Our moderator tonight is Edward Keller, who in turn will introduce the speakers after I have quickly introduced him. Ed is a designer, writer, musician, and multimedia artist. He's also co-founder of Aum Studio, an architecture and new media firm that has produced residential projects, competitions, and new media installations in Europe and the US. Among them, competition entries such as one on vertical gardens for the Museum of Applied Art in Vienna, a house for Andrei Tarkovsky, and a museum for Nam June Paik. Keller is also Associate Dean of Distributed Learning and Technology and Associate Professor at the School of Design Strategies here at Parsons. He has conducted numerous graduate design studios and seminars studying the connections between cinema, architecture, locative media, and digital game design. And I will simply point you to the program where a more extended biography is listed. Keller once asked, in reference to a film by Antonioni, that we consider, and it's a quote, complex systems that move through a landscape which is an impure composite of technological systems, emotions, social arrangements, materials, flows, and forces. And I think with such a broad frame of reference, we're off to a very good start. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Ed, for taking over the podium.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I have a very brief set of words, and then I'll introduce all of the panelists. And when I introduce the panelists, I'm really just going to read their name and title and refer you to the program, which has a paragraph on each of them, because we do have a number of presentations to get through. I'm really glad that Karen started with a reference to the film Red Desert by Antonioni, which I have been kind of obsessed with for the past couple of years, because the main figure in Red Desert is a character named Juliana, played by Monica Vitti, who is either in a state of psychological crisis or literally a state of kind of ecological crisis herself. She's kind of indexing a whole set of changes across an industrial landscape, a political landscape, an economic landscape, and a social landscape. It's a very interesting film because the way that she navigates that landscape, I think, is not really very different from the way that we are navigating our landscapes, both the ones that we have through history, but especially now, a renovated notion of what energy fields, of what things, systems, and objects can be. So there's a porosity in her experience of the world in this film by Antonioni. And I think that we're increasingly feeling that kind of porosity ourselves in everyday life. I'll have a couple of words to say when we transition from the individual presentations to the panel. And so without any further hesitation, I'll introduce the panelists. I'm going to start with Jamie. Jamie is going to kick things off for us. Jamie Cruz is an artist and independent scholar, and as Karen has said, her project Thingness of Energy is on view right now in the Sheila C. Johnson Design Center, and that project is a catalyst for this panel. Jonathan Bach is the chair of Interdisciplinary and Global Studies program. He's associate professor in international affairs at the New School for Public Engagement. Liz Barry is the director of Urban Environment, the Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science, and she's part-time faculty at the School of Design Strategies and the School of Constructed Environments at Parsons. I should be calling people out. Maybe actually Liz, Jonathan, thanks. Jackie Bruckner is an ecological artist and part-time faculty in the Fine Arts program at Parsons. Georgina Drew is an anthropologist and postdoctorate fellow with the India-China Institute, the New School. Alan McGowan is associate professor, interdisciplinary science in the Department of Natural Sciences and Mathematics, Eugene Lang College. Arthur O is an artist. Sorry. No, that was okay. Yeah, Arthur O is an artist and the director of the BFA photography program and an assistant professor in the School of Art, Media, Technology in Parsons. And Rafi Youat is an assistant professor in politics with the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College. So again, we're going to start with Jamie, and then we're going to progress alphabetically through the list of folks in the program. I think so. So maybe the panelists will migrate back to the audience, and then we'll start with Jamie.
Thank you again to Karen and to Annie for hosting, and I'd also like to give a sincere thanks to the Office of Sustainability and the Green Fund for supporting my project, The Thingness of Energy. So tonight my presentation is based on the research that informed one of the 5 boxes included in the Thingness of Energy installation that's currently being housed at the Sheila Johnson Design Center. This particular box is called Vibrant Matter and the Power of Configuration. On November 11th, 2011, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations delivered a timeline to an audience of industry executives, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and members of Congress. This timeline detailed the unfolding of events at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant during and in the critical hours following the earthquake and tsunami on March 11th, 2011. The story contained within the document, entitled A Special Report on the Nuclear Accident at the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Power Station, reads like a screenplay. The gravity and the immediate hours of the accident, detailed and delivered through stark legal language, rises up and confronts the reader to deliver a poignant reminder. When things don't go as planned, it's human bodies that must show up and try to steer things back on course. The report could serve well as a reference manual for contemporary designers, architects, urban planners, and engineers. It's a powerful invitation to consider configuration in relation to infrastructure, design, and planning. Configuration: how and where we stage what we design, how humans and infrastructures are situated and inevitably interact. Yet humans and infrastructures do not exist only in relation to one another in the landscape, but also in relation to a multitude of earth forces that are capable of rising up and challenging our best design and engineering capacities. TEPCO, the electric company that owns the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plants, clearly had never imagined for, nor planned, for the spectacular multitude of forces that materialized on March 11th. Sunio Futami, a nuclear engineer who was the director of the plant in the late 1990s, has stated, "We can only work on precedent, and there was no precedent. When I headed the plant, the thought of a tsunami never crossed my mind." In the crucial minutes and seconds in which the unimaginable actually does unfold, highly complex situations transpire in instants, and the configuration of people and things becomes fundamental to what happens next. Reality shifts into a configurist map in motion, a landscape of tripwires and tipping dominoes, each action, placement, and location sends a vector of consequences propagating into the far future. How high do the waves crash against the bluff? Where are the fire trucks parked in town? How far inland do the dry casks sit? How deep do the spent fuel rods rest in their cooling pools? How far are the exit gates from here? Where each building is sited in relation to each human, each fire truck, each monolithic seawall, each wave, all matter immensely and in interconnected ways. This highly particular configuration of things varies from moment to moment, and is what will mix and ramify into resulting nexts. Water is no longer water, but a substance, flooding basements, storing backup generators. Utility employees become authorities, emergency personnel, evacuees, heroes, and victims. At Fukushima, the force and scale of the events reconfigured an energy-generating plant, typically a life-supporting affordances, into something else, something unrecognizable. Fukushima Daiichi shifted from being an energy-producing infrastructure into a risk-generating machine with massive geologic consequence. The facility dissolved into an assemblage of unpredictable actants, taking the form of zirconium rods, uranium, plutonium, hydrogen, salt water, copper, plate tectonics, massive waves, electricity blackouts, design ingenuity, engineering failure, steel, reinforced concrete, basements, and sea walls. These elements not only performed independently of human desire, but they acted back upon us in profound and irrevocable ways. Many of these things become forces, continue to do so today, 12 months later. Some will continue to do so for generations to come. These actants compose the shifting trajectory of global energy futures, as they birth new actants, such as long-term power outages, evacuations, containment failures, explosions, aftershocks, media coverage, government relations, industry investments, energy dependency, and changes in public opinion. Collectively, they insist that we pause and ask ourselves, what if anticipating geologic scales of force, change and effect, became a common design specification? What if energy production, policy making, and infrastructure design accounted for such lively and wildly unpredictable actants? Thank you.
We're all describing different aspects of a very similar thing, energy. Fukushima will make an appearance here too. So thank you very much, Karen and Ed and Jamie, for the very inspiring exhibit and all the work that went into it. I wanted to pick from the description from tonight a couple of phrases. One phrase is that energy, what happens when we think of energy as an active agent that is no longer defined as dead matter? That phrase jumped out at me. Energy no longer defined as dead matter. But energy was never dead matter. It's matter that can be stored, released, activated, kinetic, potential. To think of it as dead matter means that to access it, we must bring it to life, putting the human being in the role of the animator, of God, of creating a golem, a Frankenstein, RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, a sorcerer's apprentice, right? And note how all of these stories invoke homunculi, so that even if we could speak of bringing energy to life, can we bring something to life in a form other than anthropocentric, than the anthropomorphic? But energy is neither dead nor alive. It is. It is like air, invisible but everywhere. It is air, at least in the sense of qi, one of the earlier and most convincing definitions of energy. The steam rising from rice, clouds of breath on winter days. It is not that energy is alive, energy is life, and there is a difference between being alive and being life. We cannot speak of energy's consciousness, but we can speak of consciousness as multiple forms of energy. So how can we even make the statement that is in the text that energy was once, quote, defined as dead matter, unquote? How can we get to that point that we can talk that way? Even Mr. Joule referred to thermal energy as a living force. But Mr. Joule made energy measurable. And this is decisive for answering this question, for turning energy into a thing, and thus for how we relate to energy today, as units of measurement that conflate the term power with energy. We speak of horsepower hours, kilowatt hours, calories, sieverts, becquerels, electron volts, reciprocal centimeters, grams of TNT. We measure the invisible force, and through measuring, we make it visible. When we measure energy, we can speak about it in terms of the amount of work performed, which is the standard definition. The echo of the word work is instructive here. With measurement, the mystery of energy gave way to the mystification of energy. In the old-fashioned Marxist sense, we now see the end product, light, heat, refrigeration, etc., but the work, in its many forms, itself is invisible. With modernity, an invisible force, energy, is made visible only, again, to be made invisible. But the Marxist analogy only goes so far because energy lacks the capacity for epistemic privilege that Marx attributes, rightly or wrongly, to the laboring forces. The event text for today asks, what if energy were to be considered a partner? As partner, we seem not here to be talking about equality per se, but rather recognizing energy as an actant in a network. The network, in a sense used by Bruno Latour, involves humans and non-humans, engineered and extant artifacts. Not a technical network like the subway or a computer, but, as Latour writes, a topology of nodes that have as many dimensions as they have connections. Nodes that have as many dimensions as they have connections. This framework allows us to think of energy outside of the spatial metaphors that Latour finds so limiting in studying society and nature. Energy is both far and close at the same time. and time is both geologic and morphologic, fast and slow. Energy is neither inside nor outside, down there or in here or out there. Energy is an actant, something to which activity is granted. So in my field, loosely interdisciplinary social science, this matters because it allows us to see energy as a form of meaning production, energy as an actant in the social production of meaning, not as an outside cause or a factor. This gives human and energy both a degree of agency that the metaphor of breathing life into dead matter, right? The Frankenstein golem breathing life into dead matter metaphor, which that metaphor denies or turns in on itself in catastrophe. Partnership, however, is a positively valued word in our world, and perhaps it imparts more of a normative desire to live in harmony than actual partnerships reveal. So let me conclude with some observations about one such network or partnership, if you prefer. I've had the opportunity, for personal, not professional reasons, to observe some of the reactions to the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. I've become interested in the cultural adaptations around radioactivity in a country where radiation has long been a tragic fixture in the public imagination. One result has been an increased interaction of people with the measuring of radiation as a daily occurrence. All my friends and relatives in Japan have an iPhone app that relays radiation readings based on location, which they check all the time. These readings are aggregated from various sources, including crowdsourced networks such as Japan Geiger Map, which includes citizens who upload readings from their own Geiger counters. Radiation levels are constantly changing and moving location, and they play a role, for example, in where and how long some mothers let their children out to play. Parents buy food only from certain regions or from certain stores that do their own testing. Radiation readings occur like the weather report. I'm not concerned here with the scientific accuracy of private radiation readings, which often only show the amount and not the type of radiation. Rather, what is interesting here is how these readings shift agency and knowledge from experts to a wider public, even if quite imperfectly. This results in many false alarms, but also a new emphasis on networks, such as the Twitter post that has photos of a handheld Geiger counter that's being held in Tokyo Station's, on Tokyo Station's Tokaido Shinkansen platform, the train coming from the north, showing an alarmingly high rate of radiation and hypothesizing that people arriving from the north are carrying radiation on their shoes and other leads such as these that the media and government follow up on. These private readings also call attention to the levels of radiation that exist independently of the reactor accident. This ranges from lots of discussion about natural levels of radioactivity found everywhere from hot springs to airplane altitudes, to the discovery last October of 2 boxes of highly radioactive bottles containing radium-226 hidden under the floorboards of a 90-year-old woman's house in Setagaya, who claims she has no idea how they got there. So, in conclusion, radiation in Japan after the March 11th disaster, the first anniversary of which is next week, is a Latourian node with as many dimensions as connections. Energy here is not a partner in the colloquial meaning of the term partner of being on the same side, which conjures sort of images of our friend the atom or Astro Boy, the mighty atom. Rather, it is an invisible partner that, once called into perception, makes the assemblage of modernity visible and allows us to retrace and rethink the assumptions, practices, and pathways that shape modern life. Thank you.
I just have to switch computers. 1 second.
Is that you or no?
Hmm?
Is that your notes? No.
I'll be good. Great. Thanks for everyone who organized this and who thought about including me. I'm Liz Barry, and I'd like to share some ideas and lines of inquiry from the Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science, our collaborative research community. This talk is all sunshine and rainbows. Sunshine is in electromagnetic energy, and rainbows is in spectral analysis. Stromatolites, the first life form to harness electromagnetic energy, sunlight, and the first to catastrophically alter the Earth's atmosphere. They filled the iron-rich seas with their byproduct, oxygen, which caused rusty flakes to precipitate down onto the seafloor, forming thick beds across the planet, visible here in Australia. Eventually, the iron in the sea ran out, but the oxygen had to go somewhere. After about 1 billion years, oxygen began to fill the atmosphere. In some ways, the oxygenation of the atmosphere precipitated the largest die-off in Earth's history, not only because anaerobic organisms were disadvantaged, but because oxidizing atmospheric methane induced one of the most severe and longest ice ages in geologic history. It also created the ozone layer, which we benefit from today. Also today, the rate of energy capture by photosynthesis is about 6 times larger than the power consumption of all human civilization, approximately 100 terawatts. And there's a physicality to photosynthesis. It's the source of carbon in all organic compounds within organisms' bodies, referred to as primary production. In all, photosynthetic organisms convert over 100 petagrams of carbon into biomass every year. That's just a lot. So during photosynthesis, light is transformed several times. It comes in as electromagnetic energy, is transformed to mechanical energy, and finally into chemical energy. But of all the lights that plants are busy transforming, there's lots of light that they don't use, mostly in the near-infrared range. So let's keep talking about plants, but switch to how electromagnetic energy, or light, can be used as an investigative tool to learn more about them. For instance, when capturing aerial imagery in both visible and infrared, those 4 bands, R, G, B, and near-infrared, can be recombined to create what is called NRG, or false color. In such composites, chlorophyll shows up highlighted in red. This is an image of a community garden in Colorado. This technique works at the scale of a single plant, shown here at Parts and Crafts in Boston. This diagram shows visible light passing through a sample substance, then being split through a diffraction grating, such as a DVD at 34,000 lines per inch, which reveals which wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum were absorbed by this sample in the form of a simple graph. Molecules are always reflecting or absorbing light. We can take advantage of the whole spectrum in finer detail, not just 4 bands, to learn about what chemicals are present in a given sample. A spectrometer can identify which materials are present in a sample because the molecules are vibrating. Their vibrations correspond to radiation in the infrared region of the electromagnetic spectrum. In the same way, the length of an antenna is related to the wavelength that it's tuned to pick up. This is what spectral analysis is based on, and it's used in the natural sciences from genetics to astronomy. The one we borrowed for calibration cost $80,000. So where's the consumer option? We thought we'd give a try at making one. So we took a cardboard paper towel tube, put a razor edge slot in one side, a piece of broken DVD in the middle, and we picked up a camera to take a picture of the spectrum that was cast based on the sample. We tried this out at a workshop at the Whitney. Lots of folks are working on improving the designs, such as Jeffrey Warren, who sketched this video spectrometer in a holder with a tray for the sample and a fixed light source. This is our current DIY toolkit. You can pick this up from our site and start investigating yourself. And here's the open source spectral workbench software that you can download to analyze the spectral lines you collect. This is a video of sliding a spectrum through the software and then marking that as a baseline and adding a second spectrum for doing comparison. The inspiration for this approach came from sound, another wave-like phenomena. Music/sound is a spectrum too, and a lot of the same math applies to music and light. The spectral workbench software was inspired by audio analysis software. And this example of using a spectrometer along with mapping those wavelength values to sound is being enjoyed by this nice fellow. Uses for this technology include searching for polyaromatic hydrocarbons in the water around the Gowanus Canal, monitoring nitrogen balance in home aquaponics systems, or comparing varieties of wine, as illustrated here. Here's an example of the kind of data that's recorded. Sometimes I call them gap-tooth rainbows. Can you tell which spectral lines belong to red wine or white wine? So we're interested in extending this DIY spectroscopy up to the scale of geography to get not only maps with 4 bands, but to get something like this hypercube, which is generated through hyperspectral remote sensing. So thank you, and I would love to hear your ideas about sunshine and rainbows.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and Karen for getting this organized. Jamie? And you?
Sure.
You want to set me up? That's not me. That one, I think it's that one, yeah. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okey-doke. So what intrigued me to participate in this was the original announcement that said, how would policy change if we treated energy like a living being? Then it got cut back to an acting creative agent. I think living being was probably a little too radical. But that's what got me, sparked my curiosity, all puns intended. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Actually, what I'm going to talk about is how treating energy as a living being isn't enough. Because if you look to change policy, I'm not a policy person, but if you look how we treat living beings, either of other species of which we're extinguishing more species today than have been extinguished in the last 65 million years, or if you look how we treat our own species where we kill people all the time, I think that you can see it's not going to change policy very much. So I think we need to do more than that, and I think we can get some understanding if we look to other cultures and how they have perceived energy. If we look to, here's the Renaissance with a nod toward Greece, you can see that the wind gods, the Aeoli, are here personified. But if we look to Japan, this is the wind god Fujin, excuse my Japanese, and when he opens his sack, the wind escapes. And this is actually probably the derivation or the origin of windbag. He doesn't look too fierce. Here's the god of thunder, Rajin, I think is how you say it. But if you look here, he's getting pretty serious now, and he carries these series of drums that he rumbles for the thunder, and also strikes lightning with. For fire, if we look to Egypt, fire, whether it's whatever source we get it in, we look to Egypt, we have here Ra, the supreme god, who's the ancient Egyptian sun god. He's part bird, beyond the human. He has the cobra on his headdress, and is very powerful. He's also the god of air and is associated with the breath of life, so he was the creator god. In the Aztec creator myth, the sun god, I think it's Tonatiuh, demanded human sacrifice. At least that's what humans thought. And if you didn't sacrifice humans to him, he wouldn't move from one side of the sky to the other. And we might think of this as a rather primitive, barbaric practice, but really how different is this than all the human life we're currently sacrificing in the Middle East, ultimately, for that same fire energy? Actually, I wasn't sure whether we call it earth energy or fire energy if it's oil, but it sort of mixes both. In Hinduism, the sun god is an ancient and revered deity called Surya. And you can see him holding lotus blossoms in his raised hand with female archers on either side who drive off the hosts of the night. Fire is universally understood to be related to the sun and to lightning and to the hearth and home. And it helps make that transfer from one level of reality, the cosmos, to the domestic. If we look at water power, and again, here's the Renaissance, we get some sense of turbulence. And notice how often horses come up in this, what we ended up calling horsepower. I think Leonardo actually catches the feeling of water energy, the turbulence, the turmoil, and the struggle of it much more powerfully in this little drawing. Earth energy, if we go to either mountaintop removal or a man in a coal mine. And here we're looking at the Sumerian goddess Asherah. There are two aspects. She's the goddess of life and fertilizes the field. But she also, when she withdraws her favor, the fields wither. So she's both a goddess of life and also barrenness and death, and similar to Demeter in that way, the Greek goddess Demeter. Artemis is obviously a fertility goddess. Again, there are lots of horses, lions, and many other kinds of animals that she's associated with, as well as this abundant, overabundant life. But the Aztec goddess is much more fearsome. If we get in close, you can see that she has these snakes in her skirt, these fangs on her face, and the death head in the middle. Which brings me to the idea of the word sacred. If we think of energy as sacred, we can look at what the meaning of that word is. The sacred, its etymology in Greek and Latin, going back to the Indo-European roots, has actually a double meaning. One meaning of the sacred is that which is imbued with divine presence, our usual thoughts about it. But the other meaning of the sacred is that which is forbidden, too powerful, and out of bounds for human contact. And so if humans touch it, it's at the threat of divine punishment. So affected is it with an irradical pollution. It evokes horror and disgust. And this second meaning of the taboo, really, acknowledges limits to our human power and knowledge and understanding, acknowledging that the powers of the cosmos far exceed the wonders of our minds and our human technology. We live in a desacralized world where we have lost both understandings of the word sacred. If we see how the forces of power that flow through us are embedded in the sacredness and mystery of life, of which we are part of, perhaps we can avoid a collective fate of walking into this. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to be here tonight. Like the other speakers, I was also very fascinated by the prompt and its various iterations, which had their own flow and fluidity, which I think has created a great array of presentations that will hopefully translate to conversations later on. As a reminder, I'm Georgina Drew. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the India-China Institute, where I teach in the environmental studies and religious studies departments. I also coordinate a research project on everyday religion and sustainable environments in the Himalaya. As an anthropologist by training, I think that this panel raises an important opportunity to address different ways of viewing and inhabiting the world. And anthropologists, among others, have drawn from very extensive data and have been helpful in pointing to the many places in the world where people already do think of energy as an agent, a collaborator, and a partner. The heart of inquiry about the so-called thingness of energy is the social construction and dissemination of knowledge. Some think in terms of epistemologies, or ways of knowing and sharing knowledge. Since knowledge is power, in addition to being powerful, epistemologies can be highly political. New arguments point out that ontologies are ways of being and acknowledging, the world, are also political. The political ontology approach asks us to consider different ways of dwelling expressed by a range of cultures and the stakes involved when those ways are challenged, oppressed, or even obliterated. Indigenous activists sometimes employ a political ontology stance to validate ways of being that are not entirely subsumed by European modernity, though they are sometimes influenced by them, and in some cases this causes less internal confusion to those indigenous peoples than it does to the people that study them. Political epistemology and political ontology are significant, I think, for this conversation because they involve a process of dialogue and a terrain for struggle. But in thinking about the thingness of energy, the figured worlds perspective, which I'd like to put forth today, and here I draw from scholars such as Dorothy Holland and Jean Lave, offers another way to acknowledge how energy is or could be considered an actor. Figured worlds describe the culturally constructed realms of interpretation in which agents are recognized, significance is assigned to different acts, and particular outcomes are valued over others. The figured worlds perspective is a lens through which one views the socio-historical and ecological landscapes and learns to value some things over others. In this framework, worlds and vantages are constantly being constructed, and as they are created, they are also contested. This is part of the figuring process. The figured worlds framework is powerful because it can apply to something as banal as an environmental protection agency meeting, notions of femininity on a college campus, and even the cultural worlds that might seem distant and unfamiliar to us in this room, such as tribal practices on the other side of the globe. The figured worlds perspective is important for understanding energy because in certain figured worlds, the oil and coal from the earth, the wind in the air, and water in the rivers can be seen as actors or agents. This is true in particular Hindu, Buddhist, and animist traditions. It is also true in some framings of the cosmos. My most favorite recent example is a book and film by Brian Thomas Schwimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker called Journey of the Universe. And here I've brought in a few copies to pass out if anyone's interested. Their description of the evolving of our universe over the last 14 billion years allows one to understand how closely tied we humans are with the dust of the Big Bang, the power of the sun, and the gases in our atmosphere. Their long lens view helps to construct a perspective on the beauty of this particular third rock from the sun that enabled, in a way that allows one to see how many elements came together in a just right way that enabled life to form and thrive on Earth. Their figuring of these processes helps reconfigure stardust, periodic table elements, and energy as a set of real actors without which human life could not be possible. Since I've alluded to the significance of religion in the figured worlds perspective, I'd also like to share the example of the Ganga River in India, which will be familiar to many as a case in which water is seen as a living agent, actor, and being. For my PhD research, I documented conflict over hydroelectric dams along the Ganga in the Indian Himalayas, close to the glacial sources. To devotees and development planners alike, the waters were an embodiment of a divine personage, that of the Hindu goddess Ganga. The debate over harnessing the river's waters was about whether the goddess would be okay if she would concede with her waters being used for development and the economic enrichment of her people, or if she would rather be left to flow unfettered to fulfill her duties as a spiritual savior. In both of these positions, and here I'm greatly simplifying the debate in the interest of time, the river's actorness was completely unquestioned. No one considered it just a river. The energy it produced, in fact, was positioned by development proponents as being an extension of the goddess's power, also known as her Shakti. While there were different epistemologies and ontologies that people drew from to address the impacts of dams along the river, the biggest debate was over the figured worlds in which dams were considered to be either blessed by the goddess or a source of her ire and displeasure. In a landmark case, and here I fast forward to the punchline, the government of India canceled the proposed dams to honor the sentiments, faith, and love for the goddess that many dam opponents expressed. There's more to say, but the point is that there are ways to flip the lens on how we view the sources of our energy and the agency they exhibit in the here and now. And I think what we've seen tonight already has done that quite significantly. And I thank the organizers and Jamie as well for putting together a very compelling set of images and prompts. I think that the conversations we have also allow us to challenge the normative perspective with ease and see different figured worlds in which we collaborate to produce and consume energy with non-human actors. If we can look at various levels and from multiple cultural perspectives with critical and renewed eyes, I think we can also see how the sources we have used to create energy have always been an integral part of the process. If we learn to look at them from different vantages and to hear their stories, we might even come to realize other ways to honor and interact with them. Thank you.
Yeah. So, oops.
Okay, great. Okay, this has been terrific so far. I can't wait for the conversations and the questions coming in. I speak to you from the trenches of science and engineering, and trust me, sometimes it does feel like the trenches. And look at some of the ethical questions that I think are raised by our transition. We are going to have a transition, whether we like it or not, whether we plan for it or not, or whether we think it's going to come. It's going to come. The 50 years from now are going to be much more different than, 50 years from now are going to be much more different than now is from 1962. It's just inevitable. If we plan for it, it may be a hopeful transition. It may be something that we can live with. But if we don't plan for it, there's going to be a transition anyway. The background that I speak from, and there are many people speaking about many backgrounds, is that global climate change is here, it is real, and it is important. And it's important for a whole bunch of reasons, a few of which we'll touch on. So transition from what? Well, this is what the energy mix looks like today. The current uses of energy, you can see they spread pretty much across the map. Look at the role that coal plays in our economy. Look at the role that natural gas plays in our economy. Renewals, if you had this slide about 5 years ago, that would be about half of what it is. So it is increasing to some significant extent. This is the way we use our energy, pretty much spread over the entire use of the economy, the entire economy. We currently use about 98 quads of energy. That's 98 quadrillion BTUs. That is an enormous amount of energy. It's about 25% of the energy use in the world. We constitute about 4% of the population. So you can see that we are big energy hogs. What are we going to transition to? Now, the statement up there is not going to be liked by many people, but it is simply not possible that technology alone is going to solve our problem. It's just not going to happen. If we think that global climate change is a problem, if we think we need to move out of the current situation into a more equitable, a more reasonable, a healthier situation, it is going to be difficult. We are going to have to make choices about the way we do things. If I were to talk as many people do and put efficiency there as a source, that would have to be somewhere between 20 to 40% of our current use of energy. That's a big number. Okay, so what are some of the questions? Well, let's examine them. You can read just as well as I can. It is an embarrassing fact, embarrassing to me anyway, that one's race is the best predictor we have of the amount of environmental pollution a person is exposed to. Not income, not profession, not anything else, but race. So given that that is the case, and given that we are moving into a new and different society, how do we equitably share the costs and the benefits? In a country where our income disparity is increasing, not decreasing, but increasing, even in the last 4 years, how do we pay for all of this in an equitable way? And the final question, most of the alternatives that we are talking about that we need to move into are more expensive than what we have now. One of the things that we did in a course I teach on renewable energy, where one of the students says, my gosh, I thought all you had to do was put in solar energy and that would solve the problem. She said, this is hard. Yes, it is hard, because if you count the expense of the alternatives and the land mass that these alternatives take, it is going to be very difficult to move the transition. I think that we need all of the perspectives that are being talked about here tonight, from art, from anthropology, to manage our transition and make sure that everybody in our society, both in the United States and worldwide, benefits, if not equally, at least equitably. And there's a difference between those terms. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Arthur O, director of the BFA photography program at Parsons. Thanks to Karen for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming. So I wanted to address photography and its relation to energy. So considered as a process, photography has everything to do with energy. At virtually every step in the photographic process, energy is absorbed, consumed, transformed, converted, and transmitted. Prior to the official invention of photography, that is, before people were able to fix an image in a permanent form, the concept of photography has long been in existence in things like the camera obscura, which is essentially a dark chamber with an aperture or a small opening that focuses light, sunlight, because that was the strongest available light source to form a reflected image inside the darkened chamber. In other words, light, or broken down to the elementary particles of photons, is an essential part of photography, without which the process itself would not be possible. Early practitioners experimented with various ways to fix the image, using materials and substances, and transform the energy of light into a permanent record. Before digital capture replaced analog processes, the use of silver became prevalent for most of photography's history because of its light-sensitive properties. Silver halide, which is derived from silver, is a compound of silver ions and chlorine, bromine, and or iodine, and turns black when exposed to light. This is because exposure to light causes the silver halide to transform atomically and build up density on the film surface. This is an image of a close-up of a Tri-X film, which is now discontinued. This is because exposure to light causes the silver halide. As the silver-based photographic processes became commercialized, photography's use of energy increased exponentially, not only in the manufacturing of cameras, film, paper, but also in the mining and extraction of silver, processing, transportation, and so on. Now that photography has shifted to the digital realm, its relationship to energy has also dramatically changed. But the relationship is no less intertwined. I will skip on speaking about the use of energy on the camera or capture level because this step of the photographic process is conceptually the same in the digital realm. That is the collection of light on a light-sensitive element with digital sensors now replacing film. I will speak briefly about transmission or the circulation of photographic images. This is the first digital camera, which was made by Kodak in 1976. At that time, they chose to not go forward with manufacturing this device because they thought everyone wanted photographs to be printed on paper. This is a processor that processed the analog or the digital information on the tape cassettes. When John Darkowski said in 1976 that there are more photographs in the world than bricks, he was probably reasonably right. Now, however, we can say without a doubt that this is the case. Google image search was launched in 2001. At that time, there were 250 million indexed images on the internet. In 2005, that number is 1 billion. In 2010, it was 10 billion. This expanding digital archive has fundamentally changed our relationship to photography. Every time a person runs a Google image search, the company's data centers, which is filled with computers, use electricity. Those data centers around the world continuously draw almost 260 million watts, about a quarter of the output of a nuclear power plant. This is a very different use of energy in the history of photography, but one that has now become integral and points, again, to the ever-expanding mechanisms of the photographic process. There's another kind of energy that is difficult to quantify and may relate to Jonathan's idea of the actant. This other kind of energy is hard to quantify and measure in scientific ways. Though hard to define and describe, it is undeniably present in certain photographs. This type of energy is particular to the photographic medium that no other medium or process can produce. There are numerous examples of this, but I'll just use one. In August 1966, during an especially turbulent historical background with University of Texas shootings, protests against the Vietnam War, catastrophic earthquake in Turkey, NASA sent the space probe Lunar Orbiter 1 on its reconnaissance mission to survey the lunar landscape, with a main goal to find an appropriate landing site for the soon-to-begin Apollo program. Lunar Orbiter 1 captured, for the first time in the history of photography, images of the lunar landscape and of Earth from the perspective of another celestial body. On board the spacecraft, a specially built 70mm Kodak camera and processing unit that prepared the photographs for transmission back to Earth as video signals. This data traveled some 240,000 miles to reach its destination. Undoubtedly the longest distance at that moment in time that an image had traveled to reach its receiver. Whenever I see this image, I imagine, this is the image, I imagine those first individuals that encountered it and what they must have thought. I think about the entirety of the production that made this image possible: manpower, brainpower, rocket fuel, electricity, natural and man-made resources. I think about the exchange of all of this consumed energy with another kind of energy, the energy that comes from seeing oneself from outside of this world, a brand new perspective. And that was in 1966. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm Rafa Hewitt, Politics Department at NSSR and Lang. I'm going to start, like a couple other people, with what the panel asked us to think about today, which is to think about energy as a partner in the endeavor of producing and consuming energy. In particular, the idea that energy is an active agent that we ought to recognize as such in order to make human life sustainable on the planet. This shift away from human activity as the sole locus of agency resonates very deeply with me. The work that I've been doing on biodiversity and more recently on interspecies relations. Rather than foregrounding a version of agency as free will, right, in which a sovereign agent acts in contrast to the tyranny or the power of social structure or natural structure. It means thinking both about non-human agency in various guises and also about human agency in a way that means that it's not quite human even when it's exercised at its utmost. So in these more general terms, to use Jane Bennett's terms, agency is a force with trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of its own, and energy of various kinds certainly seems to fit this description very well. My basic worry today is the one sort of major point I'll try to address, is that by focusing on the active agency of energy only in relation to human sustainability, that on the one hand we have a more complicated material story that surround our actions. We're now part of a broader assemblage. We're taking greater account of what energy and its infrastructures are doing. But in having that focus, my worry is that we skip a few too many actors or actants along the way, particularly in an ecological sort of a context. We now have human beings connected into material assemblages, but ultimately addressing the question of human sustainability. And in the end, I think that framing might make sustainability itself perhaps not impossible, but at least undesirable if we don't have greater recourse to something that is more ecological, a concept that involves other species as well as ourselves in pursuit of the good life, as political theorists like to think about it. So put differently, the question for me is ultimately, how does this vast infrastructure surrounding energy, how does it interrupt the agency of other species? How does it interrupt their own energy cycles or transform them and us? And to what ends should these sort of interlocking agencies be directed? Survival, sustainability, or something more? So I briefly want to talk about the ANWR drilling debate, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, just as a brief example of what this looks like. This has been a political debate in the U.S., right, for a number of decades now. On one side, environmentalists emphasize the idea that drilling in ANWR will deeply scar the pristine wilderness. They tend to float images like these. This is the coastal plain at the edge of the reserve. And they emphasize that there are the networks of infrastructure, roads, pipelines, platforms that would be necessary to extract it. This is a shot from NRDC, for example. Arguably, though, their most poignant appeals are to the impact on wildlife, especially the porcupine caribou herd, which numbers in the tens of thousands, sometimes in hundreds of thousands, in what's called the Serengeti of the Arctic, right, by environmentalists. On the other side, pro-drilling contingents like to emphasize that there's a very small footprint that's necessary to drill, and they suggest that pipelines and rigs are ultimately not incompatible with wildlife, right? So you have these pictures like this, caribou sort of sitting happily with drilling rigs. This is at Prudhoe Bay. And what I want to suggest is that both sides here are missing something about non-human agency. I think that pro-drilling forces are missing something about the political quality of the pipeline with respect to other species. Other animals, much like humans, are surely adaptable to a variety of circumstances, but that doesn't mean that all such circumstances are equally good or desirable. Remaking wild species into quasi-wild ones and remaking wildlands into functional resource extraction units means that the agency of oil certainly has come to the fore, but it's chipped into the potential of a wilderness interaction between human and non-human, and therefore the rise of one kind of agency ultimately has to impact the possibility of agency elsewhere. Moreover, proponents of drilling in Anwar don't tend to think of energy as having agency in our lives in the sense of constituting a kind of societal addiction. And so a conversation about non-human agency in that context is certainly welcome. For their part, environmentalists tend to emphasize the purity of wilderness that misses the possibility of ecological life transforming or adapting, right? The possibility that caribou could sit happily next to this rig, or that bears might find alternative uses for pipelines is not necessarily considered, right? Species are not social actors, therefore they have natural needs. They only do one programmed set of things. And yet, since environmentalists are trying to get us to rethink our relationship with nature on grounds that are something more than oppositional, it seems to me that foregrounding non-human agency is a way for environmentalists to make their claim as well. This might, in the context of New York City, lead to interesting kinds of thoughts about urban ecologies, what it means to design multi-species spaces. An example out of Chicago, this is a terribly grainy image. There's 60 or so coyotes in the middle of Chicago. The police are aware of them. They've deputized them. They are tracked with radio collars and generally promoted because they reduce rodent infestations and keep the Canadian geese population down. So by thinking more about interspecies relations and the kind of material infrastructures within which those exist, I want to suggest that we can move forward both on the wilderness end and on the urban side to thinking more about the good life in the political sense rather than only about sustainability or survival. Thank you.
So I would ask the panelists to come up and join us at the table. So early in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, 100 Years of Solitude, a character says, "Things have a life of their own. It's simply a matter of waking up their souls." And this character is a gypsy named Melquiades. He's explaining magnetic force to some folks who've never seen it before. So they don't really understand what's going on when the magnet pulls things. But the concept of the soul of a thing as an index of its active affect could be useful for us today. And I just want to raise a couple of images, ideas, landscapes here which are resonating with what everyone has already been talking about, and then kick it back to the panel. So it seems that one of the things that's at stake today is our ability to think about energy and things, really to think from a non-anthropocentric point of view. The changing porosity and boundary of a body that I evoked with the example from Antonioni's film Red Desert in the beginning has been reiterated over and over again in all the examples that we've been given. And so the idea of energy as a thing or a thingness seems to be connected to things as fields, things as systems, things embedded within an expanded field. And energy itself is a kind of information. And there are two examples that come to mind in the context of ethics, which we just heard from at the very end from Rafi, and also across the way. Bolivia's recent work to pass a law protecting the ecosystem by establishing its legal rights, which is, I think, a very interesting example that ties back into both the ideas of an indigenous culture, but also a global culture, and the energy systems passing through that ecosystem. And then, in only a partly humorous vein, I'm also reminded of a second example, one that novelist Charles Stross gives us. It's a near-future scenario in one of his novels where a young artificial intelligence, which is comprised largely of a neural network taken from a lobster stomach in a science experiment, requests human assistance and asylum. So this very young neural network artificial intelligence has agency. It has recognizably human agency, But the kind of agency and the nature of the actant that we've been hearing from the panel about is often a compromised kind of agency which can't speak for itself. And indeed, even in the example from Charles Strauss's novel Accelerando, the agents can't really do everything they need, which is why they take recourse to asking a human for help. In the example of the Bolivian attempt to pass this change in their law, the ecosystem lacks such an obvious agency. And so the question really seems to me to be how we can grasp these different degrees or regimes of agency and understand, in a way, what they themselves desire. So the limit of the human is constantly changing. It's a constant epistemological horizon. We know now that the human microbiome, indeed, at birth and through the life of the adult, can change the way that the dopamine expression in the brain works. So the definition of the limit of the human has changed. We see ourselves, as I believe Rafi at the end was saying, we see ourselves no longer fully human, that we're human, not quite human. And so the very last question for me seems to be, what does energy itself want that we can acknowledge? What kind of agency and actancy does it already have that indeed might be more than ours? And I'm thinking here of Arthur's point that the number of photographs has increased so dramatically that it might outnumber the number of bricks. So again, energy is information, energy with a desire of its own, the life of forms in energy as opposed to the life of forms in art. So I would throw that question, what does energy want, to the panel. And maybe we could work backwards from Rafi. The human, not quite human.
I'll take a short stab at replying to that. I'm not sure what energy wants.
How come?
For me, and I'll say why. Maybe this will help. For me, the question of non-human actancy and what it is that things want means that we have to decide the network. Right? We have to decide about the network within which that starts to make sense. So the question of what any one person wants is related to the community, the society within which they exist, right? And so those wants and desires and needs are not intrinsic for me, but are a function of a social network or a political network or a community. And so the question of what energy wants or desires for me means we have to sort of stipulate, well, relative to which community. If we're only talking about it in relation to humans, then we might say that it wants to master us in order to get us to release its potential, right? We'd use all sorts of useful anthropomorphisms, as Jane Bennett's term. There are ways we could think about energy that way. But on the other hand, if we are thinking about an ecological community of some sort, then what energy wants changes. It might not, it doesn't want to be released in the same sense, depending on the framing of the community in question. So that's as far as I'll go to start with.
Jackie.
Yeah, before we get to what energy wants, I do want to address that. I wanted to pick up on your references to porosity, because that's a major metaphor for me. But I want to talk about the porosity of the human. 90%, somewhere between 90 and 99% of the DNA in each of our bodies is bacterial. And none of us can breathe, literally, without the trees and the plants. So that makes me wonder where the trees and the plants begin and end, and where we begin and end, and the bacteria as well. So this idea that we're an isolated anything is a fiction. So there's a kind of species porosity that I think we have to internalize, and really it's going to call for a dramatic change of everything, our view of the cosmos. And I would say similarly, the question about what does energy want implies that energy is a kind of monolithic thing. It's a singular that you ask the question, and there's nothing monolithic about it as far as I understand. Karen Barad's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, I don't know if you read it, but it's like huge and hard. But the takeaway, the easy takeaway is that energy is, the cosmos actually, is this dynamic, entangled, ever-changing thing. So energy sometimes is embodied and held in something. At other times, it's explosive and moving. So I think that's going to also depend on each moment is going to call each moment and each place in this incredible cosmos that's filled with galaxies that we have like the smallest clue about anything really, is going to call for very, very, to use an art term, site-specific decisions.
Arthur, you had finished by saying that you were impressed with the idea of energy that we receive by seeing ourselves from outside the world. And it seems like the point of view transformation that you're invoking there, and the ability to take that kind of shift in point of view and catch the blind spot, if we could shift that so that we can see the porosity that Jackie's talking about.
Yeah, I think when I started my talk and in referencing, the photographic process, having been in existence actually since, I think 300 and 400 BC, which is much, much earlier than, the supposed official date of, 1839. I think the drive, to recreate reality has always been there, to recreate our perception. And I think, photography was a step in that process, but now, with computing power, replicating reality in a way that's almost complete. I think it's almost it's possible within, I think, 30, 40 years, according to the increase in processing power. But so I think that all of the necessary kind of steps and the energy that's needed, to run, machines like this would, probably. This is, from research that I'm doing for a project, on the extension of photography, the expanding field of photography. That such machines would be possible, but to actually run it, it would take years, to recreate, let's say, 2 minutes of actual lifetime. So the trade-off, between consuming and expending, energy, to recreate, this effect, it doesn't really kind of balance out. And I think that there is a lot of disparity with which we use energy for, certain, very kind of mundane uses, that I think it's something to really kind of consider.
It seems like shifting the agency to the network, or the knowledge, the production of knowledge to the network, and this is a point that Jonathan made. The way that you've talked about photography and the way that Jonathan has called out the specific example of radiation monitoring, those are two parts of the same process.
Right.
I think the question is whether we've instrumentalized enough today that transition, and what Liz is doing with Public Laboratory, whether we've instrumentalized that transition enough so that we can actually leverage it in the next 2 or 3 decades.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add something real quick, that I think that your photograph actually illustrates really well how our frame has been so limited. Like, we're offered an image that we haven't seen before, and suddenly the frame widens and we realize how much we have missed and how much escapes us. And we're at this point now where we're just starting to realize in terms of energy that so much has been escaping us. And if we're talking about what energy wants, then it seems like the perfect moment to realize that the products that we're using for energy, the fossil fuels, and we ourselves are this result of a highly exquisite configuration that far exceeds us. That it's a product of billions of years, and so it escapes us. So how could we possibly know what energy wants? And so maybe it's about realizing and acknowledging that we've hit limits of our understanding, and that's what we have. That's maybe perhaps our best tool to work with, is about acknowledging that.
If I could add to that, I was also going to point out the limitations of our ability to perhaps hear and see and understand this process, dynamic process that is energy. Recently at the New School, we had an event on lived religion, and there was a scholar from Mount Allison College in Manitoba, Barbara Clayton. She presented on Buddhist environmentalisms. And based on their orientations, they were Canadians by heritage. They had drawn from their teachings in the Shambhala tradition and to formulate ways to be more productive and sustainable in creating forest products. And what they decided after a series of trial and error, managing in rotations, managing, various ways of manipulating the environment, the main point that came out of their process and their experiment was the value of sitting still and doing nothing. That when they stepped back and just experienced the forest and let it grow up around them, they found ways in which the forest itself became more efficient without them manipulating it. So I think that sort of lesson challenges the idea that perhaps the ecosystem doesn't have agency. I think that oftentimes we just miss it because we are thinking on a different temporal level, and we have different expectations and abilities, perhaps which are much more limited than what an eco perspective might have to teach us.
Sure.
Coming from science, where we try very hard not to anthropomorphize things, issues, whatever, it's a little bit hard to respond to the question, what does energy want? Nonetheless, let me try. It seems to me that if energy wanted something, it would be to be useful, to be helpful. When I go on the treadmill in the gym and it tells me how many calories I have used, I'm working my tail off and I've used 200 calories, which means that my body is a lot more efficient in using energy than many of the devices that we use, many of the things that transport us from one place to another. And therefore, we could learn a lot by looking at ourselves and determining how we might use energy a lot more efficiently, wasting a lot less. I do think that ecosystem does have agency. We don't know it. If we don't pay attention to it, it comes back and hits us on the head. Rafi made some very interesting points about sustainability. We cannot be sustainable if we don't pay attention to the ecosystem in which we live. It's not paying attention to that ecosystem, which includes the atmosphere. That means we're putting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which means that we're warming the planet more than it has been at a rate higher than ever before, so that the ecosystem cannot adjust. That's going to come back and hit us. That's agency.
It strikes me that I appreciate that you brought up the question of whether it can be anthropomorphized, and I definitely wasn't trying to do that. When I was saying, what does energy want, it might more be what is the propensity or the proclivity of energy, and what are the likelihoods that it might do something which seems from the outside to be a human intention, but we've already said that perhaps even humans are not quite human. This issue, indeed, this issue brings me back to a point that Jonathan brought up, that it's living as not living, where I'm rephrasing a point that he made. Energy is neither living or not living. And I thought that was a very fascinating way of putting it, because this then plugs back into the question of what its tendency might be. Liz brought up the point of a massive die-off at a certain point in the planet's history, after the banded iron formations were produced, which are still being mined by Rio Tinto in Australia and in other places. So there's a several billion-year-old kind of legacy of a particular planetary scale event that took place, which propagated a massive die-off, which from the point of view, of course, of that moment in history was extremely unfortunate, but from a point several billion years later was quite interesting. So I wonder if I can ask Jonathan again to talk a little bit about the consequences of the shifting agency and the way that knowledge then being produced by the network might have some kind of consequence in relationship to energy's agency.
That's a more complex way of rephrasing the question, what does energy want? Which I was sort of scribbling some more flippant answers to. So maybe I'll run through those and get to that. I mean, one of them was ask the Lorax, but that's sort of conflating energy with nature.
Well, he's selling cars right now.
Yeah, among other things. How do we know what energy wants? The modes of knowing, some of the things that were already addressed, is, I think, really, in a sense, what the question is ultimately about, because how do we know what energy wants is the only thing that we can have some sense of. What does energy want? Well, it depends what energy is. I mean, we talk about energy here in very broad terms. In one sense, what it wants is entropy. It wants the second law of thermodynamics. That's what energy wants. If you can say that's intentionality, which you probably can't. You could say it wants to be configured or designed, then maybe not by human hands. But then we are talking about something which we haven't talked much about, despite many images of it, which is the tension between anthropomorphism and ontotheology, between the divine and the human. So is there some other answer to that? That's leads to another direction. And then in answering what is energy, if it's a life force, it wants to be. If it's a system, it wants to follow its path-dependent dynamics. So it wants lots of things, depending on how we think of what it wants. How would the shift of agency in a network? Well, I'm thinking of the example that I was trying to use of the shift from expert knowledge to a wider and imperfect general knowledge. For example, having everybody go out there and measure radiation, which if you think about the 1950s and fallout, I mean, you didn't have that technology. You couldn't have everybody running around measuring their own radiation and uploading those figures. If we had that kind of situation today in the United States, you'd have a very different kind of response of crowdsourcing the radiation. What's the effect of that? I mean, certainly at one level, it's the effect that you've got a lot of lay people talking about science in a way which they probably never would have before. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? It's probably a good thing on par, despite all the misuses and misrepresentations of it. It certainly shifts the burden of proof on the experts. So at some level, if it doesn't make them more responsive, at least it makes them more accountable in some way, so that you can't have the same kind of discussion about nuclear energy that you had before, unless this, blows over too quickly and then disappears. But in Japan, I think it's settled in a way which is a little more difficult to erase. So the shifting of these networks does change the way in which we think about our relation to energy on a daily and embodied basis. And I kept being struck by the term private reading, which comes up a lot with people doing their private readings, that's used very colloquially, of radiation levels. And for some reason in my head, I kept having this image of somebody doing a close private reading of a text and interpreting it in their own way. And so maybe there is a kind of a private reading that goes on along with this very public dissemination.
I feel like, Liz, you could speak to that because your public laboratory work is doing that all the time right now. And there are certain interesting legal and ethical dimensions to that. The sort of digital equivalent of a paper trail so that information that's gathered can be acted on.
Sure. I'm not quite sure how to relate it directly to energy, but in terms of lay people getting involved in science, I'm all for it. I mean, it was at some point, a couple centuries ago, science stopped being just a mode of inquiry and became a profession. And as we know, professions are dissolving right now. So that seems quite appropriate to me. So the burden of proof and knowing and how do you collect data that can be used as evidence? That is an interesting back and forth between local expertise and legal expertise. But I would just say, in terms of our context here about energy, I like to think about energy as a way of knowing, and very often it exposes what we don't know, as everyone has more articulately said. But I would say, why don't we think about exploring the properties of light to tell us about stuff and figure out some new directions?
Yeah, I saw the connection between what you do when you track things like the combined sewer overflows or the change in temperature in the Gowanus Canal and the need for that to be rendered visible to a legal body. I saw a parallel to the comment that Jonathan made about work and the process of mystery becoming mystification. The rendering invisible of work or the rendering visible or invisible of knowledge. And it seems like right now we might be, I personally am very optimistic that we're at a moment where citizen science can actually make a substantial turn and make almost everyone who's at least in the first world and has access to certain kinds of technology extremely powerful as agents in seeing their world. Alan?
Yeah, a little history, because I totally agree with you, and I think that the distributed knowledge, if we can make it happen, could be very powerful. In 1957, there were no dosimeters that people could have. There was no digital information, but there were baby teeth. Turns out that strontium-90, which was a product of fallout, is deposited in the crypt as the baby tooth is laid down. Therefore, a baby tooth is a very accurate measure of the radiation that a child has been exposed to. And in St. Louis, Seattle, Boston, and one other place, there was the baby tooth survey where scientists working independently asked people to send in their baby teeth, and you get a postcard, give a tooth to science. And there was tremendous information available about the levels, and it horrified people when they actually found out what levels their child was being exposed to, and then they started measuring babies' breast milk. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed, and it was, to some extent, supported by the testimony of mothers who came to Washington and testified they didn't want their kids exposed to strontium-90. So citizen science can be extraordinarily powerful and has been. And I think with the tools of photography and digitation of data, the citizen scientist can be a very powerful force in society.
Jamie, there was a kind of an implicit temporality when you talked about configuration. And configuration is both configuration of a system, like the design of the reactor, but it's also the design of the experiment that Alan was just talking about, right? The gathering of the data. And there's a model that's in place around that. So there's the configuration of the system or the experiment, and then there's the configuration of the scientific model that's in place. It seemed to me that, again, that was connected back to an implicit temporality. Also, you talked about how infrastructure can turn into risk. So infrastructure goes from being something that guarantees a certain kind of future to being something that produces a completely different set of futures. So all of these, I want to tie this back to a comment that Rafi made about trying to understand what information and energy want. It's very difficult to identify that because in a given system, it's going to want something different than in another system. So in a living system, energy may move in a particular way and want something, but in an inanimate system, it may be frozen and arrested, or it may move in a completely different way. And so those are part of the configuration question. They're part of the kind of implicit temporality of it. And so for me, again, the question becomes how we position ourselves with intention in relationship to those kinds of interactions within the system where we can see a predictable future turning into an open future. I think risk cuts both ways. Risk can be very dangerous if a human life is at stake, but then risk can open up a possibility of future with which infrastructure, in a strange way, forecloses on.
I mean, I think as a public who are starting to sort of sense these changes, there's the ability to realize that there's always more to the story and that things will move of their own accord and that the wind will pick up what we set in motion and mix with the water, and that those two things are completely independent of us and they were before us and are after us. And so as a public, we realize that whether it's the tar sands or mining, that we're setting into motion through our actions things that move completely of their own accord and will continue to do that. But we know that. We know that already because we know there was strontium-90 in the teeth that wasn't supposed to be there. And that as a public, it's almost we are ready to acknowledge those gaps. I mean, I look at the Indian Point website, and I'm always sort of surprised by their domain address, which is safesecurevital.com. And so there's this weird thing where, like, we as a public are sort of, do we really believe that? I mean, there's just no gap for the unknown. It seems like we're ready to, like, face the reality that things will move of their own accord. There's the possibility for things to unfold differently, and that it's a time maybe to usher in a new version of corporate responsibility that is about acknowledging all of the unknowability, the configuration of things that we can't control, and that we as a public actually have to want to not have the illusion of the tight ship and that things are better than they are, that we have to ask that of them and sort of want the story to be told differently, and that the configuration sort of ripples or propagates from there.
Yeah, Georgina brought up the idea of collaboration with the non-human, and I think that collaboration could be quite dangerous, no? I mean, if collaboration isn't working together to produce a particular outcome, collaboration is just interaction. I'm thinking also of Jackie's images of the dangerous goddess, or the seemingly dangerous goddess.
In answer to that, I would turn the question that was posed earlier, and I would also encourage us to think about what we want from energy. And I think that one thing that we would like is to not be harmed by it, which is part of the collaboration process. And there are many ways. I think the science has been really important in showing the ramifications. Of course, the baby tooth was one example. Hugh Raffles, in his book Encyclopedia, has also talked about the nuclear fallout and how it lives on in the animals and how it comes back to us eventually. There's also parables that people have been telling for a long time. I think about the Hindu tradition, and there's a story about this time when the gods come to know that there's nectar at the bottom of the ocean, but they can only get it out if they get the demons to work along with them to create a powerful enough force to get that nectar out of the seas. They do this, but it produces the most potent toxin in the world, and it's going to be to everyone's calamity, except for there's one god, Shiva, who's the destroyer, who's able to consume it and transform that energy through the power of his destruction. So I think that there are ways of seeing the way that yes, energy neither lives nor dies, it circulates, but it can be used for ill or for good. It can have positive repercussions. It can come back to harm us. And we need to be responsible in our use of it. And I think that's where, asking those questions in advance is important, having the right information and the access to information, which, the community scholars and the academics have been really trying to bring to the forefront is another. And then mobilizing to use those technologies on a political platform in a way that is, quote unquote, sustainable, although the term is highly problematic, is the most important part.
I would keep musing on how 3.5 billion years ago, some single-celled organisms got a great idea to use solar energy and brought on snowball Earth. Right? They destroyed everything that there was to enable more energetic oxygen as a more energetic life-supporting medium than the previous, methane. To enable this new form of life, which is us, includes us, and all that's around us, to come forth. And I would just, think about coming technologies and the human network porosity, all the other terms that people have said, and how essentially, catastrophic change might bring about, a higher energetic state.
Yeah, just following up on that, in terms of the apparently difficult goddess, awesome where it really means something. We don't really know what's good and bad. I think that's, we have a very, very limited perspective. And so the word human comes from a root that not only shares the root with humus, but also with humble. And we have a little humility amongst our species would be a great thing, I think. And a sense of limits that somebody down here said. If we could value our own limits, and be more cautious, I think. Not assume that we know the whole story, because we know so little of it.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. First of all, I'm looking at a work of art in production over here. It's quite amazing. There's a concept in environmentalism is the precautionary principle. Mm-hmm. Just be a little bit careful. Just don't do everything you think you can do. Be cautious. And if you can demonstrate that it does no harm, then you can do a little bit of it. We built huge dams before we knew what the impact of those dams was going to be. Maybe if we built one and then looked at what happened with it, we'd be in a lot better shape. But we haven't had enough controversy in this panel yet, so I want to just point out that we also have to know things. People have talked about nuclear power. I'm not an advocate of nuclear power, but I do want to point out that per unit of energy produced, coal kills 100 times as many people as does nuclear power. So the better thing is to use less energy of all kinds, right. But let's not think that technology is going to solve all of the problems.
And not all nuclear is the same. We stopped nuclear research in this country 30 years ago. Other parts of the world have advanced. They have safer nuclear. Pebble bed.
What, pardon?
Pebble bed nuclear reactors.
Sure, yeah. We have pebble bed reactors here.
In the United States?
Yeah.
I heard the fuel we make in Los Alamos, we have to sell outside of our country because our nuclear reactors are too old.
Oh, no, that's true. I didn't mean they were in operation. I'm sorry, I misstated. We know how to do them, but yes, no, we can't, we haven't had a nuclear plant since 1975. I don't want to get into the whole story about nuclear power because it's very complex and very difficult, but we basically built the wrong kind of nuclear plants. No question about it. That does not mean that nuclear should be in our future, but we need to think about it.
I wanted to ask you something about the cost. You were saying the cost of renewables was very, more expensive than what we've got now.
Right.
But does that take into account the tremendous subsidies that the fossil fuel industry has?
Very, very good point. No, it does not.
So-
It's still, it makes it closer, but, I mean, we did an article in Environment Magazine where I'm executive editor by a team of people in Colorado. If you look at the military cost and other costs of oil, it's 4 times the price that you pay. We pay, as taxpayers, a subsidy because we protect the fuel lines, we protect the oil routes and so forth. Yeah, so you're exactly correct.
Well, and I think also that we need to factor in more, as many people have been saying over the years, the environmental costs and the externalities of a lot of these projects that are so, quote unquote, affordable. And it would be interesting to see, I imagine someone might have already done it, but the per unit price of the Fukushima power plant, including the efforts to clean it up and contain it.
Which brings in another cost factor certainly for fossil fuels, which is all the externalities.
Right.
So those aren't even
question
begun
about
to
it,
be
right.
factored in.
No question about it. I mean, look at the oil depletion allowance, for example. I mean, we subsidize the drilling of oil. We don't subsidize in the same way solar cells or wind turbines or whatever.
We subsidize the building of roads,
Right.
which is the automobile, which is fossil fuels.
Right.
If I could just jump in with one small point on nuclear power, if you have time. I mean, I think there's a contrast between thinking about nuclear power as a human safety issue, right, or as a sustainability issue on the one hand, and as an ecological issue. Again, when you look at not just the reactors, but where the waste is disposed, you end up with some very interesting sorts of parallels. Peter Gallison has a project on nuclear waste, the areas where nuclear waste is disposed of, and wilderness areas, and points out how much they actually have in common. Right? These sort of like barren areas in the middle of Nevada where people do not go. It's a place where humans are not supposed to move through.
Yeah, well,
and so just to sort of push that thought all the way through, right?
No, I agree.
If you're looking at the full picture beyond
sustainability,
then there's an ecological.
There certainly is. But look at the pictures. It was a picture of a mountaintop removal. I mean, how do you get coal in this country? You ruin the land in which the coal is placed. It's an ecological disaster of huge proportions. I mean, the groundwater there is contaminated forever. Those people will never have good drinking water from wells in those areas. Never, ever. It's gone. Once you pollute the aquifer, it's finished.
What about fracking?
What about fracking?
It seems like
Exactly.
a good moment to follow up on the point that Ellen made, which is do a little bit and then really test. But humans, and this is a point that I remember Smudge Studio and Jamie and Elizabeth making a year or two ago, humans might not even be engineered to be able to perceive the horizons, temporal horizons that they need to perceive to be able to understand what it means to wait the right amount of time, if that right amount of time is more than just a few years.
Yeah, there's a very you've probably heard of Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning inventor of behavioral economics, who's written a book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you've gone into any bookstore, it's there. It's a very interesting book on just that point, on what humans remember as opposed to what they experience, for example.
This fellow just brought up the issue of our ability to comprehend what we're facing. I mean, you talked about the transition that we're moving toward, and you said that equity was an important element in that transition. Well, equity is going to be the first thing thrown out the window. When I grew up in New York City. It took me a very long time, I was probably about 35 or 36, before I realized that I live on a series of islands. For all the time that I was living here, it never occurred to me that these were a bunch of islands that I was living on. And I had no connection with the earth. I don't think that the human species has evolved enough to be able to comprehend anything on this level. You showed those photographs of the ancient mythical gods, the Japanese and the Mayans or whatever. And you could see how the people were struggling to try to understand their place in this universe and what this universe was about. I'm not the camper type, and I very rarely in my life has anybody ever dragged me out into the woods to have to sleep under the stars. But the first time it ever happened, it was a night of a new moon, and I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. It was really dark. And I said, my God, get me out of here. But you know, we've been lulled into thinking that the world that we know, when I turn on the switch, I expect the lights to go on. I can't even comprehend that not happening. And yet
Go to India.
Something is happening, and we really don't know what it's all about.
I would say we're spoiled in the United States by switching the light switch and the light goes on. Travel in 3/4 of the world and that doesn't happen.
Well, but it does happen here.
It does happen here.
Imagine it
Right.
never
Right.
happened.
It's funny because the first time I came to New York City, I thought, get me out of here. There's too much light. How can I get back to the dark and the stars? It's a different point.
Do we have more questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of great thoughts going on the panel, so I had different questions. But I think the thing that strikes me the most that's not being talked about is the role of biotech. So in terms of the crossover between the ecological and the quote-unquote human or technological, and the more we see this as one system and not a dichotomy, how will our understanding of biology lead to, I don't know, new practices, and how long, and that brings up the ethical question we were just talking about, how long should we wait to investigate these practices? I just recalled off the top of my head, this Freeman Dyson article about how we could just grow plants to not reflect as much light, and then we would harness more of the sun's energy more efficiently. But the article didn't really go into what if that ended up killing us all for some reason. So I was just interested if the panel had any interest in biotechnology, and I guess spectroscopy made me think of the Freeman Dyson example with silicon-based sunlight capture, energy capture, as opposed to carbon-based, but chlorophyll-based.
Well, I think it's true that I don't know quite what you mean by biotech, but for example, there is research going on. Craig Venter in California and the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Science in Bermuda looking at the growth of algae to produce fuel that is close to the energy density of fossil fuels. One of the problems with replacing fossil fuels is that they are very energy dense. You get 400 miles to 20 gallons tank with 18-gallon tank, which is pretty far for a little bit of material, and also there is a lot of research on, pardon the expression, genetically modified organisms that are much more stress resistant, much more drought resistant than the natural crops. So there's a lot of research going on. It's extraordinarily controversial, obviously. As soon as I mention GMOs, you can see how controversial it is.
Just on the GMO angle, there are a number of different ways of approaching that. I mean, there's the capital-intensive way of approaching it, which is very high tech, and then there is a mixture of information sharing combined with older ways of breeding. So if you can do gene sequencing on a set of organisms and you can know the traits of those genes in advance, you have a much better shot of breeding in a particular direction than if you're just shooting in the dark.
Right,
so there are kind of lower capital intensive ways of doing quote natural GMO.
Right.
I think we're nearing the end of time, so I just want to jump in and maybe respond a little bit to the former question, if I could. And I think it really brings us back to, at least in my opinion, the politics of knowing. And I would challenge the idea that we've always had a limited frame of reference. I think that this is why the field of religion and ecology is so robust and expanding, because there have been a lot of ways over the years that people have been sharing insights. There's, the Hindu framework, which I've mentioned, and I'll just say that there's 4 main cycles of time. We happen to be in Kali Yuga, which is a period of degeneration, but this process takes about 432,000 years. So the unit of time that the people see themselves as being a part of is quite expansive. So the ecologies are supposed to decay along with human integrity, but that's a very gradual process. We're only supposed to be in the beginning of it. That's one point. Another is that a lot of the insights that come out of meditation in Buddhist practitioners, there's a lot of cross-talk between physicists, for instance, even quantum physicists, who are learning now scientifically or empirically what a lot of Buddhists have been putting forward in terms of metaphysical theory for a long time. So I think that Jonathan was talking about kind of modernity and kind of the limitations of modernist thinking, or at least that's what I remember, because I often talk about that as well. And I think we always have to remember that. There are different ways of knowing and being in the world, which is why I was trying to also present the figured worlds framework. As scary as it seems to be with the prospect of not being out without electricity, or being without electricity, there are other ways in which, if you cycle your time around the day, around the sun, and have candles in your home, and it becomes a completely different rhythm of life. So we can't get too myopic around what we're used to. There are in the present many other ways of being, which can be just as fine as the one that we're experiencing right now.
There are a lot of lights in this room, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes. Too many.
So I think we're out of time now. So I want to thank all of the panelists for fantastic presentations and discussion. Thank Karen and Vera List for organizing this event, and Jamie for putting together the project, researching the school, the Furthest of energy. Yeah.